Please turn in your Bibles to John chapter 12. John chapter 12. There's a deep symbolic meaning to the triumphal entry of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem. It fulfilled the prophecy of Zechariah in every detail concerning the king who would one day come to his people. John gives the general sense of Zechariah's words here in verse 15. But he leaves out some important details. When you look up the prophecy itself, its fulfillment becomes the more remarkable. You see, John merely says, "Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king comes sitting on an ass's colt." Well, that's certainly what Jesus did. But John's quotation doesn't do justice to the original proclamation. Zechariah wrote, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes unto you. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, upon a colt, the foal of an ass." John said, "Fear not." Zechariah said, "Rejoice greatly and shout." John merely said, "Your king comes sitting on an ass's colt." Zechariah said, "He is just, having salvation and lowly." And how beautifully that described Jesus. First, nobody, not even the Pharisees, could accuse him of being unjust. His whole life and ministry demonstrated truth and righteousness. Second, he had consistently presented himself as the channel of salvation. And he confirmed his claim to divinity by the miracles that he'd performed. And yet, despite all that, third, he was lowly. He never put on any airs and graces. He lived as one of the common people, often without a place to rest his head. And now he was content to ride into his capital city amid the acclamation of ordinary folk who had seen him at work and who recognized him as their Messiah. It's surprising to me that the Pharisees and the priests, who were students of the Old Testament and its prophecies, couldn't see this remarkable fulfillment taking place before their eyes. And yet such is the blindness of men without God. They did not see because they could not see. That was their problem. By contrast, many in the crowd of ordinary people upon whom the Pharisees looked down with disdain recognized Jesus for who and what he was. It's another clear illustration of the fact that God is no respecter of persons, and he reveals himself to whomsoever he pleases, regardless of their place in society. Mary was a nobody in this world. So were Joseph and all the disciples. And yet they were chosen while kings and priests went on in their blindness. Well, this crowd was made up partly of those who had witnessed the raising of Lazarus and partly of those who had heard about it by word of mouth. Verse 17. The people, therefore, who were with him when he called Lazarus out of the grave and raised him from the dead, bore record. For this cause the people also met him, for that they had heard what he had done, and that he had done this miracle. The Pharisees therefore said among themselves, "Perceive you how we prevail nothing? Behold, the world is gone after him." Despite all their efforts to silence Jesus, despite their instructions to the people to notify them if they knew where he was, here he was riding openly into the city amidst the jubilation of the people. It must have been very discouraging, very frustrating for them, to say the least. Verse 20. And there were certain Greeks among them who came up to worship at the feast. The same came therefore to Philip, who was of Bethsaida of Galilee, and desired him, saying, "Sir, we would see Jesus." Philip comes and tells Andrew, and again Andrew and Philip tell Jesus. Now, of course, there were millions of Greek-speaking people in the world in those days. Most of them worshipped idols. These Greeks were different, however, because we're told specifically that they'd come to Jerusalem to worship. That means that they were proselytes, Gentiles who had been converted to Judaism. Now they approached Philip and they asked to see Jesus. Why Philip didn't go directly to Jesus with their request is not known. Maybe he hesitated because these people were Gentiles. Maybe he wanted confirmation from another disciple before he took action. Most of us tend to be like that from time to time. It doesn't matter anyway. The thing that puzzles me is the response of Jesus to their request. Did he consent to meet with these Gentiles? We don't know. Did he address these next words to them or to Philip and Andrew? Your guess is as good as mine. It would seem most likely that he was speaking to the disciples, in which case we don't know whether he spoke to the Gentiles or not. But certainly the disciples didn't understand what he was saying. Verse 23, and Jesus answered them, saying, the hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Now, let's just think about that for a moment to get our bearings. The word hour is often used in the New Testament to indicate a general period of time, not 60 minutes. Jesus still had 5 days to live, and yet his hour had already come. Jesus, of course, was glorified not so much by his death on the cross as by his resurrection 3 days later, and by his triumphant reception by the Father after his ascension. His glory was his triumph over sin, over death, over Satan. And upon its completion, it became retroactive, so to speak, to include his entire life and ministry. So as we look back from the finished work, we see that his glory was the whole thing, but it didn't come to its fruition until the resurrection. The Lord's next words describe the process whereby this triumph was achieved. Verse 24, verily, verily, I say unto you, unless a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides alone. But if it die, it brings forth much fruit. Now, Jesus seems to have himself in view here in this verse. He himself was the corn of wheat who would have to die so that much fruit would be brought forth. Just imagine for a moment the harvest which his atoning death produced. Had he saved himself, which he could so easily have done, just like that, had he saved himself, had he opted not to drink the cup of the suffering on our behalf, not one single soul would ever have been saved. Throughout the years of the Old Testament, the sacrifices looked forward to and pictured his death. They were waiting for salvation, but they looked forward to the death of Christ for their salvation to become effective. It wouldn't have become effective otherwise. If Jesus hadn't died, their sacrifices would have been of no use. They were looking forward to the death of Christ. Throughout the New Testament, of course, believers have looked back to that same event. It's the one single event in history which ties everything else together and gives it meaning. Had it not happened, history would have been meaningless. There would have been no hope, no future, no purpose for living. The human race would have been doomed to a useless existence on this planet with nothing to look forward to but darkness and death. And just as a seed must die before fruit is brought forth, so Jesus had to die before souls were saved. Now, someone might say, how could the death of one man make such a difference? I know this is a common question. And the answer is, of course, that the death of no other man could have made any difference. Because every other man who ever lived from the time of Adam to the present day has been a sinner, and under the same condemnation. Therefore, Jesus alone, because of the virgin birth, had no blood ties to the sin of Adam, and was therefore free to represent the rest of us. He had to be sinless in order to represent sinners, and no other man ever could. Had Jesus committed one sin, just one small sin, he would have been disqualified and could not have represented us. As it was, he knew no sin, and he who knew no sin accepted in his own body the penalty for all of ours. All of ours. And God was satisfied with the offering. And so the corn of wheat died, and salvation was made possible for millions of souls who were already dead in trespasses and sins. However, having first applied the principle to himself, Jesus then applied it to those who wished to follow him. The same principle. Verse 25. He who loves his life shall lose it, and he who hates his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal. If any man serve me, let him follow me. And where I am, there shall also my servant be. If any man serve me, him will my Father honor. Now in verse 25, the English word life is repeated 3 times. He that loves his life shall lose it. He that hates his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal. Now the first 2 times are the translation of the word psyche, which means soul. The third is the word zoe, which means life. So the object of love and hate in this passage is the soul. Soul. Now the soul is the seat of the emotions and the will. It's the psychological man, the natural man within each one of us. That's why psychology is for the birds. It tries to dress up the natural man, make him better. Can't dress up the natural man, he has to be replaced by a new man. There is no good polishing up the old man, making him better. That doesn't work. So anyway, the soul is the psychological man. And it's that part of us from which lusts and passions and desires and feelings arise. That part within which bitterness and resentment resides. It's the soul that needs to be saved because it is sinful. The Bible says the soul that sins shall die. Now, if I cling to that part of me and allow my feelings and emotions to control me, which is very easy to do, then I cannot fully surrender to Jesus Christ. And I become a slave to my soul. Jesus said, no man can serve 2 masters, for either he will love the one and hate the other, or he will hold to the one and despise the other. That's Matthew 6:24. On the other hand, if I reject it, if I reject the passions and lusts and so on within me, my soul in other words, and I recognize that I must relinquish its fallen condition and drives, then I am free to serve Christ and let him take over and give me life, Zoe. The words love and hate there are simply Eastern expressions of contrast, like black and white or hot and cold. And they're not used in the ordinary sense, but to drive a sharp division between loving one and hating the other. As the original corn of wheat, Jesus had to reject his human feelings, the feelings within his soul, and choose the path which he would rather not take in order to save us. And now we are called upon to do the same. It applies to us all, from the lowest to the highest. Maybe some of you saw a documentary this past week on the life of President Kennedy. Here was a man who was brought up in a religious background, but had never been taught this fundamental lesson. Consequently, although he rose to the highest position in the land and was looked upon by millions as a shining example of achievement, it was all a sad facade. He remained a slave to his own passions, placing the nation that he led in jeopardy as the result, and was unable or unwilling to break their power until the day he died. It's a sad illustration. Now, we're called upon to die to self and choose Christ. And that's not an easy thing, because the flesh is weak and its demands are strong. But unless we obey, we cannot bear fruit. Fruit doesn't come from the soul. It doesn't come from the feelings and the emotions and the will. It comes from Jesus Christ. And that's the only source. Verse 27. Now is my soul troubled. He doesn't say my spirit is troubled. He says my soul is troubled. My feelings are troubled. The man in me is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this cause came I unto this hour. I'd like to ask him to save me from it. But that's why I came. I came to die. Jesus knew where he was headed, and anticipation of that ordeal filled him with dread. Once again, the same word, psyche, is used here, soul. His spirit was serene, but his soul was troubled. His emotions and desires revolted at the thought of what was to come. Don't ever let anybody give you the impression that all there was to the cross was the physical agony. Many people were crucified. Just imagine the agony of having the sins of the whole world from the time of Adam until the end of the age lowered upon you when you knew no sin, and having the God of whom you were part stand away from you and leave you alone on that terrible cross. That was what brought the agony, not just the pain. Probably, I'm sure he had the same feelings as any of us, probably more intense, because his emotions were not hindered by sin. So he was probably more alert than we are. But his spirit ruled, not his soul, and he was willing to disregard his preferences in order to carry out the Father's will. And praise God, he did. Verse 28. Father, glorify thy name. Then there came a voice from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. The people therefore who stood by and heard it said that it thundered. Others said, an angel spoke to him. Jesus answered and said, this voice came not because of me, but for your sakes. The voice of God was not clear to the ears of those who stood by, but they sensed that the sound was more than some natural disturbance. Apparently, Jesus knew what the voice said, or John would not be able to tell us, would he? Somebody had to know. The name of God had been glorified many times in the Old Testament, of course, in Egypt, in the wilderness, at the Jordan River, at Jericho, in the Temple of Solomon, and so on. God had manifested his power in the sight of his people. The ministry of Jesus had glorified his name again. Jesus had consistently pointed people to the Father as the power behind his teaching, his healing, and his life in general. God's name would again be glorified at the resurrection of Jesus. And then during the apostolic times and throughout the church age from time to time, culminating in the final events of this age when he would come in glory. God is glorifying himself and has done all the way through. Now verse 31, now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. Jesus was referring to the cross, of course. This world is characterized by sin. At the cross, sin was judged and paid for. At the same time, Satan's power was neutralized. The prince of this world, as Jesus called him here, held the world in bondage because of man's sin. Do you realize that the ace card of Satan has not been any power vested in him, but it's actually vested in the perfect justice of God? That's where his power came from. Satan's power came from the justice of God. He said, in effect, God is too holy to look upon sin. I have managed to make man sin. Therefore, man must be cut off from God, and the justice of God must ensure that. And he was right. That's exactly what it was. But Satan overlooked the ability of God to overcome those problems. When God became a perfect man, untainted by sin, and then personally took upon himself sin's penalty, Satan's ace card was rendered useless. No longer had any power. And Satan could no longer appeal to it for his authority. So the prince of the world was indeed cast out when Jesus died at Calvary. Verse 32. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. This he said, signifying what death he should die. The people answered him, We have heard out of the law that Christ abides forever. Now sayest thou, the Son of Man must be lifted up. Who is this Son of Man? See, the term lifted up was evidently understood by the people as meaning crucifixion. They'd seen it going on all the time under the Romans. And this didn't fit with their picture of the promised Messiah. They were looking for a king who would set up his throne and deliver them from Roman occupation. Dying certainly didn't play a part in that. Had they meditated on Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, then they might have understood. But as it was, the Lord's words fell as cold water on their excitement. He was a king, and he would reign, but not in the physical sense for another 2,000 years. Physical and spiritual terms sound so similar to the human ear, don't they? And yet there's such an enormous gap between their meanings. Left to himself, man seems incapable of thinking on anything but the physical dimension, wavelength, and consequently much of what Jesus said went and still goes uncomprehended. Verse 35. Then Jesus said to them, Yet a little while is the light with you. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness come upon you. For he who walks in darkness knows not whither he goes. While you have the light, believe in the light, that you may be children of light. The analogy of light, of course, is a major theme in the Lord's ministry. John used it to introduce this gospel, didn't he? He said, In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And then Jesus himself used the picture in John 3 when he spoke to Nicodemus. He said, This is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, but men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. And then in John 8 and John 9, he used it again. But here the thrust is just a little different. Notice the progression of thought in verses 35 and 36. First, he said, light was with them. Second, he said that they were to walk in the light. Third, he said that they should believe in the light. And then fourth, they were to become children of the light. And that still is the way it should be. The light is with us. It's with us at all times. It's available to every one of us. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He who believes in me shall not walk in darkness. But just because light is available, it doesn't mean that we're making use of it. The light can actually be embarrassing. It can show up things that we would rather remain hidden. But if we're wise, we'll walk in the light and we'll follow along the path it leads. If we'll do that, then the next two steps are more or less inevitable. First, we will believe. Can't walk in the light very long before you recognize that it's true and desirable. And finally, having believed, we become children of the light. It's a natural progression. Being adopted into the spiritual family of God, becoming his children and his heirs, is the automatic result of believing. Believe in Jesus Christ and he does the rest. You don't have to say, well, I've believed, now how can I get adopted? I better fill out this form in triplicate and apply. No, you believe and the rest of it's done for you. It's automatic. Finally for today, the end of verse 36. These things spoke Jesus and departed and hid himself from them. As we've seen before, Jesus had an incredible ability to disengage himself at will from the crowd, where normal people could not have done that. In Luke 4:29, it's always amazing to me, where the Jews in Nazareth were angry with him because he pointed out that God blessed the Gentiles as well as the Jews. It says that they rose up and they thrust him out of the city and led him unto the brow of a hill whereon their city was built, that they might cast him down headlong. But he passed through the midst of them and went his way. Neat. I'd like to be able to do that. He was always in control. He was ever patient, ever loving, but in control just the same. And he still is. The world is a mess, isn't it? And without a strong faith in Jesus Christ, we have every reason to be alarmed. But if we're trusting in him, we can have peace. Because he knows where he's going. He knows where he's taking us. He makes no mistakes. Nothing catches him by surprise. And if we belong to him, then we're safe. Oh, things might happen. But I will not fear what men will do to me, because I will be able to say, the Lord is my helper. He is with me. Can you say that this morning? I trust you can. You trusted him. You've walked in the light. You've believed in the light. You've become a child of the light. And therefore you're safe. No matter what happens in this world, you belong to him.